Good evening, First Baptist Church of Jasper, Georgia. It's Wednesday night, and I'm glad that you're joining with me tonight to talk about where the Bible comes from. Did it fall out of the sky? No. There's a lot of other holy books out there, like the Quran. In 610, Muslim scholars believe that the angel Gabriel dictated the words to the Prophet Muhammad for the Quran in a cave near Mecca. Now, ours didn't happen like that. So where does it come from? As you see, I have a few Bibles here that, this one was given to me when I was a youth at the church I grew up at. These two I had to get in seminary in my New Testament class. And they're all different translations. And this one is the one that we use here at church on Sundays. That's in the pew, the New Revised Standard Version. So where did the Bible come from? Now we have to go back all the way to the Old Testament, because in our scriptures, that's where the beginning is. So thousands upon thousands of years ago, the Hebrew people began to tell stories. They told stories because they didn't have pen and paper of their faith history to one another. That's why Moses in the Old Testament begins to tell the people, when you lie down and when you wake up, when you walk along the road, tell these stories to your children. Pass this along. During the 8th century BC before Christ, they began to write down it began to get written down. Now, between the 8th century and the 6th century before Christ, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom were taken over by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And a lot of the religious life and structure was destroyed. And when Cyrus of Persia and the Persian army liberated the Hebrew people and they were able to go back home, they began to realize, oh my, we don't have, what we had originally had of just the beginnings writing down of the scriptures. So King Josiah began to push and to push the scholars to write down the stories, the laws, the stories, and to begin to help them find some identity. As the people began to help them find, where they would have, as a faith tradition, have something on paper. Now, this time, between 400 BCE and 100 CE, you began to see some of the writings from the prophets emerge. Jeremiah, Hosea, a lot of these other ones that began to show up. Now, between the time of Jesus, which is between, 3 CE or AD, the Common Era, between 3 and 33, what we believe is a time that Jesus lived on this earth, there was nothing written down. But then after Jesus' life, after Jesus' time on earth, around 60 CE, most scholars believe that Mark was the first gospel written. Now, there's a minority group that believes that Matthew was written, but a majority of scholars believe that Mark was the first written. Then became Matthew, and Luke, and John came about 30 years later after the three. The Matthew, Mark, Luke were considered the synoptic gospels. Now, they weren't the only gospels. There was the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter, and there were a lot of other Gospels that were written. And there were also, so the churches they weren't combined. They were able to be written on paper and possibly transcribed to another other paper. Churches in Palestine or in Asia Minor and the surrounding areas maybe only had access to one of the Gospels. Gospel of Matthew. One area may have the Gospel of Mark. One area may have a Gospel of Luke. If the church was more affluent, they might have 2 manuscripts of 2 Gospels or 3 Gospels. If they weren't as affluent, they might not have but 1. And if your church was on a seat connected close to a body of water where there was a lot of people coming and going, you might have access to more. But if your church was more remote, you might not have access to as many, the different Gospels. And also there was the Gospel of Thomas and all these other Gospels that were spread out into these areas. But it brought challenges because as the churches began to get together and talk, that the Gospels were different. So they were trying to decide which one's more important. Is the Gospel of Matthew important, the Gospel of Mark, or the Gospel of Thomas? So there was a lot of conflict, often between the churches about which gospel do we follow, which one is the most important. So other books around the time that the Gospels were emerging, were a lot of Paul's letters, and Paul and his followers of Ephesians, Galatians, Romans, that were written. Acts was written, which we believe was Acts was written by the person who wrote Luke. And then James and Revelation and Hebrew. So these letters were written along this time, and these letters didn't have access to all the churches. They didn't, the ones that was written at Ephesus, folks in Laodicea and other places within Asia Minor, Corinth, they didn't have the letter that was written to the Romans like we do. So there were a lot of these books out there. There were a lot of, like I said, there were a lot of letters that Paul's followers or other Christian leaders wrote that are not in here. It's the gospel. We think about the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter. As we look, they're not in this book. So how did that come to be? Why did they get left out? Well, there was a canonization process. So that's when all the books began to talk. So basically, church leaders from Asia Minor, Palestine area, I guess the bigger, more influential people got together and began to say, we got to wrestle with this, we got to start consolidating. Because there were different strands of thoughts within all these different letters, different gospels. So they were looking for more of a cohesive type group of a message of Jesus. So the first time that church leaders began to get together was in 170 AD at the Maturin canon. So all the books of the New Testament all the books of the New Testament that we have in here were considered authoritative. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Those were the Gospels. Those other Gospels, they didn't make the cut. The church leaders decided that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John had more of a consistent message than the other ones. So now there were a few. Now the Old Testament wasn't added, so it was just it was just 24 books, because instead of 27, Hebrews was left out. It was considered by the people at the council at that council as too Jewish. James was left out. James was also considered too Jewish, and James is a book that doesn't mention the word Jesus one time. So a lot of church leaders were skeptical of those two. And then 3 John. So you have the Gospel of John that was in 1 John, 2 John, but 3 John didn't make the cut. So that went for a little over 200 years. And at the council at Laodicea, at AD 363, so almost 200 years later, a group of church members got together. They felt like they needed, I guess there was more conflict and more discussion, that they got together at Laodicea and began to work on the canonization. And at that point, they put the Torah, which was the Old Testament books that we have, and put them in together with 26 books of the New Testament. So Hebrews made the cut, and after Hebrews, James and 3rd John made it, but Revelation got left out. Council, so around almost 30 years later, another council was created at the Council of Hippo, and then just following 4 years later, the Council of Carthage went ahead and added Revelation and said that all 27 books that we have are considered authoritative, along with the Old, and combined with the Old Testament. So that's where we have the 66 books of the Bible. So that's kind of a general overview of how the scriptures were put together. There's a lot of more nuts and bolts within the story, but just kind of overview of how it became, how our scriptures, how our book as followers of Jesus got put together. So hope you found this informative. I invite you to go do some more research. This stuff is fascinating, and it just kind of helps us know where we came from. And so, because to us, we just take for granted this has always been a part of our life. We don't think about, when it was written, how it came to be. That there were church leaders, over the first couple of 100 years after Jesus' life on earth that came together and decided that this book was going to be in, this book was going to be out. And how the method to their madness, we don't, some of it we might understand, some of it we don't know. But we trust through the guidance of the Spirit, and to trust through God that God worked through those church leaders and gave us what we have. They gave us what we have that, as I said, brings meaning and life to our lives and helps us understand how to follow Jesus and how to reflect the Spirit of God. So, thanks for joining me tonight. Next week, we'll begin a 3-week series it's called The First to Follow. So the First to Follow is going to be a historical overview of the 12 disciples and who followed Jesus. So it's not just going to be what we find in Scripture. I'm going to share a little bit more from church history and what we know after what we, or beyond what we know and hear. So some of these disciples we're going to know a lot about. Some of them we're not, but some of it's just really fascinating to just kind of know. But the first to follow. So I invite you next week to join me as we begin to talk about the first ones, as we are followers of Jesus. And as hard as and challenging as that might be, think about the first to follow and what that must have been like. So I invite you to come and join with me next Wednesday night. So hope you have a good night. Thanks for joining me.